It's great to be on stage again. Um, I want to talk a little bit about version control. It's kind of intimidating to come on right after a really awesome sort of cello performance and be like, "Sexy version control. Let's talk about it." But I want to talk about it a little bit. So, my background, as he said, is I was co-founder of GitHub, and now that I think about it, this is actually a very long time ago. GitHub, I've helped found GitHub in 2008, which seems, if I say 2008, it doesn't seem that long ago, sort of, in my mind, but it was 15 years ago now, right? And so I remember 15 years ago being on stages like this, trying to convince people that Git is interesting, that you should, switch from Perforce or Subversion or whatever to Git, and trying to convince people why. Why is it interesting? Why is branching a better model? Will this save you time? What is the future of version control? How will it change how you develop, and how will it change how open source software is developed? And open source software is incredibly valuable in all of our lives, right? It helps us not reinvent the wheel over and over and over, and has provided sort of a sea change in how our daily development workflows happen. And so today, I'm working on a new company called Git Butler, where we're trying to do a next generation version control system that works with Git and GitHub. But in doing that, I think we've had to think a lot about version control. Like, where has it come? Where will it go? What will the next step in our usage of version control be? Because it's a massive thing. It's a thing that everybody uses every single day, and most of us don't think about, and most of us don't question. And I think, actually, looking out at the audience, there's a lot of very young people in the audience here. There's probably a lot of you who the only version control system you've ever used is Git. And there's a couple people with, hair that has some gray in it, like me, who maybe have used some systems other than Git. But I think it's interesting, actually, to go back in time a little bit and think about where version control has come, where version control is going to go, why it's valuable to us, and why we haven't really rethought it in a couple of decades now. So I love GitHub. I helped start GitHub. I use GitHub every day. I haven't worked there in 10 years or so, but I still pay for GitHub, right? So I use it every day. I pay my old company money in order to use it. But the problem with GitHub is that it is completely ubiquitous, right? Everybody uses it. Almost all open source is on it. It has helped merge the corporate and open source worlds in a way that wasn't really like that before, in a way that now everybody uses Git. Actually, raise your hands if you don't use Git professionally. Raise your hands if you do. Okay, it's a stupid question, I know. I used to actually ask that when I was doing talks like this 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and you'd get one or two hands of people using it. It's funny, but the downside of that is that everybody uses Git, and so there's not a lot of new ideas in version control. Nobody's really questioning it anymore, right? It would be kind of stupid to try to use something other than Git, because then you're cutting yourself off from this world of open source and the world of the tooling that developers know. So I want to go back in time for a quick couple minutes and talk about what happened before. For those of you who have not used anything other than Git, how did version control evolve? Where did it come from? So that we can talk about where it's going. So the first version control system actually that I ever used was CVS, but I've also used RCS. Raise your hands if you've ever used RCS. Okay, there's somebody that still does. We're gonna have a talk over beers later about why. But RCS grew up in the 80s, right? So I think the beginning of this was in 85 or something like this. And if you don't remember the 80s, or you didn't live through the 80s, or you did too many drugs in the 80s, there weren't a lot of computers on the internet, right? There wasn't really much of an internet at that time. It was sort of the very, very beginning of TCP/IP and stuff, was all in 85, 86 or something. But people were writing software, people were sharing software, people were starting to do version control. And there was systems before this, SCCS and stuff like that. But if you look at how to do RCS, I actually did this today, where you can still install RCS, you can still use it. It is a per file version control system where you check in something and then you give it a sort of log message, even though it says this is not a log message. You explain what you're doing. You can run diff, you can see what happened, right? You can run log, it says, okay, here's sort of all the versions of this file. And I don't know if everybody's kind of seeing the similarities to the tools that you might use today, 40 years later, right? But this is essentially how RCS worked, right? So you'd have, you'd check something in, you check something out, you'd have this version control. There was actually a lot of kind of cool features of it that we don't have in Git. You could put this little like $ID thing, and then when you check something out, it'd fill it out with sort of the log of the file. You can do that with Git. You can do smudge and clean filters and stuff like that, but almost nobody does, mostly because you can't easily transfer it to other users. It's one of the things that doesn't clone when you do a Git clone. But it had branching, it had locks, and locks are interesting because this is essentially the first generation of version control, how it dealt with collaboration problems. And the way that first versions of version control dealt with collaboration problems is saying, I'm going to lock the file so nobody else can edit it until I unlock the file, and then you can edit it. And that is kind of beautiful because now there's no merge conflicts, right? Because nobody can ever work on the same thing at the same time, and so you never have problems with merging. So if you really hate merge conflicts, you might want to consider this as a way of solving that problem. And then CVS came around, and I'm doing CVS Subversion because Subversion to me is a slightly better CVS. But this came up in the 90s, and I think the first version of CVS was in 94, 95 or something like this. But if you remember at the time, if you were around at the time, there were 130 websites on the internet in 1993, right? When this software was starting to become online. And by the end of 1996, there were 100,000. It was just a world wide web. So beautiful. But this kind of took this sort of local version control and centralized it, right? So you could have something on, it networked it. It added networking. But this added a problem where the locking started to become an issue because you wanted to have multiple people editing a file at the same time. And so the way that they dealt with that, the way that they dealt with that is by merging before committing, right? So in order to actually put your changes on the server, you'd have to merge in whatever was on the server first, and then you could commit. And that's a little bit different than the way we do it in Git. And open source was like this because you had a centralized server, you couldn't fork and push into your own, and you couldn't, do pull requests and stuff. So instead, you would take down a version of whatever the head was, and you'd make your changes, and you'd create a patch file, and you'd upload it to a beautiful website like Redmine. This is actually, I took this screenshot today. This is an open thing with an actual patch on it. People still do this, but I think almost nobody in this room probably contributes to open source or is even probably done this in 15 or 20 years. But this is how open source used to work, and it was slow and difficult. And then we had the third wave. So in the 2000s, we had the third wave of version control, and I think I was trying to figure out why this came up, because there were a whole bunch of systems that kind of came up at the same time that were distributed version control systems. And what I think it was just an increase in the capacity of hardware that we had. So in 1994, when CVS and Subversion was around, or CVS sort of was around, this was a scene from a Friends episode. I don't know if anybody's seen Friends. It's a small American show, but he's talking about the kick-ass laptop that he has, right? It has 12 megabytes of RAM and 500 megabyte hard drive, and it, at the time, adjusted for inflation, this is like a $6,000 computer, right? This is the high-end sort of piece of machinery. And a decade later, when Subversion was coming, or when CVS was coming out, when Git was coming out, this is you could, you had more than that on this is the first iPhone that came out, right? And so you had more computing power in your pocket. And so I think what happened is that we went from having this centralized system where, you would have to sort of have something on a central system to having a version of that database on everybody's computer, right? And having these decentralized systems. And so we came up with this idea of having decentralized systems, and we tried to figure out how do we make this valuable, right? And so we went to this slide, and this is also generally around the time the GitHub came out. This is what GitHub used to look like in the very, very early days. But since everybody had a version of the file, we moved to this commit before merge problem or concept, right? So in order to collaborate, you'd commit something locally. This is how everybody does it now, and then you'd push, and you'd have to merge whenever you wanted to integrate it. And so it's actually kind of interesting to look at the way collaboration has changed over time, where before people really had to communicate very, very closely all the time because you were locking files, right? And so if you went to go get some version of a file and it was locked, you had to figure out why it was locked and who locked it and try to convince them to unlock it and what were they doing to it, right? And you're really communicating at the very beginning of the process. Whereas now you're committing, you're doing all your work, you're offline for a week, and then you come back online and you merge something, and the first person who merges it wins because they have no work, and the second person who merges it is screwed. And that's you can go a long time without communicating with anybody, and that didn't used to be the case. So I think we have moved due to sort of increases in hardware and increases in networking capacity to something where we're ironically communicating less or later. And the user interfaces from 40 years ago to today are not massively better. I mean, we have some nice coloring on the terminal, and that's I mean, there are obviously much nicer tools available in Git as well. But like, if you really think about it, most of the things that you do most of the days that you're working with Git are not that much different than what you would do in RCS 40 years ago. So that's the first generation, right? Is these sort of local RCS locking concurrency. The second generation adds networking, and the third generation adds distribution. And the question is, what's the fourth generation? What is Git the last version control system that anybody's ever going to be using? Is GitHub the last collaboration hub for open source that anybody's ever going to be using, right? And I think the answer is obviously no, but it's interesting to try to figure out what that will be, right? And I think it's actually valuable. You guys are building products, you're developers, right? Like, to just look at where is the future going, how, like, what does this process look like of trying to figure out how to move to the next stage. So that's what I want to talk about a little bit. And the way that I want to talk about that, which I think is a useful way of trying to, I don't know, solve a problem, right? Or think about the product that you're working on, is by both looking in the past, figuring out where we came, sort of extrapolating that into the future, but also comparing it to things that solve a similar problem in a completely separate domain, right? And for me, what's really interesting is there are collaboration tools on documents that aren't code, right? And so I want to compare what we use version control for, the way that we do it as software developers, and the way that, say, writers do it, right? Or people who use lawyers do it, right? How do other people in other professions use version control, and how does that differ from what we have and what we can use, and what can we use from that? What can we learn from that? So, fight. Let's go through all the things that they do. Also, while I was looking for this, I was like, I want little arms that I can put on these things. It turns out I found this image, and the image is from a product where you can buy these little arms to put on chickens. This is a real product, and then the chickens run around like this. And so what I think I'm going to do is buy a couple of these and then find a farm nearby and put a bunch of them on to kind of mess with the farmer. But you can buy those; they're not expensive. So let's fight. What does version control do? Oh, oopsie. My Madonna mic is picking up too much of my beautiful vocal cords. Thank you, sweetie. So what does version control do? It saves versions, right? This is one thing that it does. So how does it save versions? Interestingly, it does it explicitly. You have to go to the command line and you have to type git commit, right? Or you have to go to your GUI and you have to type git commit. You have to tell it when to save, right? You have to say, this is a save point. This is a time I want to remember. If you forget to do that, how many of you have ever forgotten to do that and then lost work, right? Probably everybody in the room. I did that. This is actually a musical break. I like the cello music better. So this is what you have to do. You have to very explicitly say, save a version. Google Docs is not like this. I kind of like this background music. I should have sent something beforehand. I would have gone Garth Brooks like stuff. But what's interesting about Google Docs is you never do that, right? You never actually have to go and say save a version. Sorry, it's a little bit distracting, but I'll try to work through it. You never have to save a version. It automatically saves everything for you. And so the question actually is interesting to me is why do our version control systems not do this, right? Why don't you start working on something and it's just recording everything that you're doing all the time in a way that Google Docs or Dropbox Paper or really any writing system online does right now? Um, I find this interesting, right? There's never been a version control system that does this, but there's no particularly good reason for it, right? It's not expensive to have CRDT data for all of the files that you're working on. It's not expensive to transfer that over the internet. There's tons of data that you can get out of that, right? One of the main problems, or one of a larger problem in version control, is the problem of code movement, right, or file renames, where Git kind of has to do it heuristically. But if we had way more data, if we saved every sort of if you saved every single version, we would have way more data in order to do more interesting heuristic analysis of code movement, right, or of code history. So interesting. I actually trying to figure out who wins. And in this one, I'm going to give Google Docs the win on saving versions because I think it's actually much more valuable to be working on something and having it constantly save your work rather than having to go and explicitly say, please save my work. Now, the reason why Git does this is because everything else before it did this, I think generally. But the other reason that Git does this is because it's useful for documentation, which we'll get to in a bit, right? It helps you say, this is why I save this, which Google Docs doesn't do, or doesn't do now. Although, interestingly, with sort of the rise of AI and being able to actually, look at changes, it probably would be relatively easy for Google Docs to go in and say, these are describe the changes that you did automatically, right? And so I'm interested in kind of where that's going to go. The next thing that version control does for us is experimentation. So one thing that we can do very nicely using version control that otherwise is relatively difficult to do is experiment with things. And if you think about the way that you do this in Git, right, this is relatively simple. I don't know if anybody, for those of you who have used systems that were not Git, version control systems for code, experimenting was a little bit more difficult, right? You could kind of do one thing at a time. A lot of times you just kind of copy the whole code base over into another directory and that's kind of your branch, right? Git makes this very easy. This was really the selling point that I used to use when I was 15 years ago trying to convince people to use Git rather than whatever it was that they're using, is show people how easy it is to branch and how easy it is to switch branches back and forth and change context and experiment with stuff and work on things in parallel. And so I think that's actually very powerful, and it's one of the most valuable things of version control for me. Google Docs really is make a copy, right? There's no great way of experimenting in Google Docs or in any of these writing systems. You can't really do a fork and do some work on it and merge it in very easily, right? Or go through review. You can do red lines, you can do sort of comments or sort of, line by line edits and have somebody discuss and improve them. It's kind of doable, but it's not very experimental, right? It's kind of difficult to go in a different way with a document, the way that we do in code. So for this one, I'm going to give that to Git. Collaboration. So again, Git, all version control systems have allowed us to collaborate. It gives us tools to collaborate in a way that's much easier. I actually worked my first job out of college. I actually had a job where there were 4 developers and they were FTPing files onto the production server from their local laptops. And if you've never worked that way, never work that way. It was not a good way to work. But it was because, and I was like, should we put in Subversion or something? And they were like, oh, so much overhead. But it's again, it's one of the main things that you use version control for is to collaborate with people. And now for open source and things, people that you don't know or don't trust as well. But this actually makes for a relatively efficient collaboration mechanism, right? The only real friction that you get here is, again, not communicating with people and having nasty merges at some point. But it's still, I think, relatively good. And Google Docs or these online systems actually has a completely different collaboration system, right? And if you think about it, there are some tools, if you guys use the Z text editor, or there's some plugins for VS Code that allow you to do this, of having multiple people sort of pair program remotely, right, where you can edit each other's files. And what's interesting about this is that this almost goes back to RCS, right, to sort of this file locking thing where or this Google Docs collaboration model, which is real-time collaboration, right? You're editing the same thing at the same time. So you're not branching off and having merge conflicts because you can't possibly, right? You're seeing what each other is doing and you're affecting each other's code. And when you're pair programming, you can't have merge conflicts with each other, right? Like you're working on the same thing. And so that's an interesting model, but it's very, very different. It has different upsides and different disadvantages from something like Git, from a distributed model, right? And so for this one, I'm going to give it a tie. There's interesting things I think we can take from the model of Google Docs in this and maybe apply to future version control systems of having more real-time collaboration or something in between maybe. The next is archaeology. And so every time I think of archaeology, obviously I think of one of the best movies ever made. But for archaeology, what I'm saying is these types of things. Like, where did my code come from? Why does it look like this? How did it become this? When I go to change something, having more context about why it was that way in the first place helps me make better decisions about how to do it next, right? And so we have these nice features like log and blame and bisect. I don't know if anybody's ever actually successfully used bisect. I think I've done it once, but in theory, it's a very cool feature. But blame is great. But the problem with blame, actually, while we're here, is blame is great because it tells you the last person to edit any particular line of a file, right? But the problem with blame is ties in with the problem of committing, of saving, right? Because if Git never saves if your version control system never saves anything, and by the way, if you want that feature and you use VS Code, there's a feature as of a year ago called timeline. So you can sort of Command P for timeline. Every time you save a file, it'll save sort of your save history of that file, and so that gives you a little bit of that of kind of being able to compare to older versions and name them and stuff. It's a very cool feature. I would highly recommend that you use it. But one of the problems with blame is that because in order to save your work, in order to not lose something, if you mess up a reset or you mess up a merge or something like that, people tend to commit all the time really crappy commit messages, right? They'll say like work in progress, doing some stuff, hands, I got hands, like there's no real great commit messages, and hopefully you go and clean them up later, but a lot of people are too lazy to do that. And so what you end up with is you do a blame and you get your commit message from who was the last person to edit this line in this function, and it's like Scott Chacon, hands, and you're like, okay, well that's not really helpful for what I'm trying to do. So in order for things like blame to really tell you the information that you want to know, you have to have a lot of discipline on your team, right? And that's hard to do. So Google Docs doesn't really have anything like this. It's really just the version history that you can kind of look back. You can rename these things. You can say, hey, I did this here, but like there's not really any archaeology in Google Docs. But part of that also is that it's one document, so it's a little bit maybe of an unfair comparison. So I'm going to give this one to Git. And then the last thing that I find interesting from version control systems, the last thing that we really use it for is for moving bits around, right? So this is actually relatively new. This wasn't really something that certainly wasn't something we did with RCS. It was kind of not as much something we did with Subversion or CVS, but it is something we do with Git. We do, Git ops. There's probably some talks on Git ops or something like that here, where you're moving bits around, right? Like what Git is really good at is being a content addressable file system, essentially, that has the transport protocol built into it. And so you can move these trees of cryptographically and how would you say that is that way? Of a never mind. You move trees, what ends up on the other side is exactly what you had on the other side, on the first side, right? And so people use this for sort of doing ops, for doing CI, for sort of building into their workflows in a way that was a little bit more difficult, I think, before, or that people wouldn't necessarily use a version control system for before. And Google actually can move bits around too, right? It has an API, you can do that. But I'm going to give this to Git because it's more valuable in sort of our general workflow. So now I kind of want to get to the end of it. What is the fourth generation of version control? And before I go into this, I have some ideas. I want to throw them out there. But what I'd really like to do, actually, this is a very, very selfish presentation, I think, because what I really want to do is get you guys to think about this, get you guys to question the systems that you're using, the workflow that you're doing, is Git actually the best thing for your workflow, for what you're trying to accomplish, right? Because it was developed for Linux kernel developers, right? And all of the features in it are really aimed at people who are taking a large sort of code base that's worked on by thousands of people, generating email patch sets, right, to go onto a mailing list and discuss and re-roll and send another series and then apply to a main branch, right? That is, all of the tooling is built around that, and all of us, I have to assume there's maybe one or two people in this audience that actually works that way. Almost everybody else uses a GitHub workflow or uses, some homegrown thing in their company or something like that, but almost nobody actually works in that particular way. And all of the tooling that we use every day, we're kind of working around what it was originally built for. And so what I think is interesting, and what I want to talk to you guys about at, we're sponsoring the after party. It's also another really good thing. This is, if you're running your own business or something, the best thing to do at a conference is buy beer for people. So I'm buying beer for everybody in the audience tonight, and what I would like is for you to come over to me and say, you know what I would really love in a version control system, because that's interesting to me. And I want to hear what you want, right? Like what does your workflow need? So what I want to do, though, is tell you some of my ideas. So, and I want you to think about, is this interesting? Is this valuable to me, right? And I think part of it is marrying these ideas, right? This idea of what the advantages of Google Docs and this kind of those types of version control tooling and ideas, and the stuff that we've used for decades now in software development version control tools. So one thing is constant saving. I think the next generation of version control, it would be stupid if there wasn't something that was sitting there watching what you're doing. I mean, maybe you're developing in the cloud at some point. Maybe, you're using GitHub code spaces or something like that. But, and so it's a little bit easier, I think, one of the reasons Google Docs does this is because they kind of have to anyways, right? In order to take all of your information as you're typing it and save it. And so it's relatively easy to just flush it to disk or whatever. And for us, we're on the command line and we're sort of running things. There's not a daemon running all the time, kind of watching for file edits, right? But I think that is the next generation of version control. It saves everything. You never lose anything. You can rewind your timeline to any time. It's like, if anybody uses rewind.ai, does anybody use that in this room? It's really cool. It watches your screen all the time, and you can find anything that was ever on your screen, right? And I think that's the future. That's the future of saving, right? Of that feature of version control. Of, I want to find something. Never do work in progress commits anymore, right? It's stupid to do a work in progress commit. You should just craft a patch when you're ready to share it. That's document the change that you're making, not use it to save something so you don't lose it. The other thing is that this helps with is track code movement, right? So if you've ever gone into a file and you say, what is this function? Where does it come from, right? And it was started in one file and it was refactored and moved into another file, and then it was moved into a third file and changed, and then you're like, what is this function? Even Git, none of the systems are relatively good at doing this, right? It's very hard to say, what is the actual history of this thing? Like, what is the context around it? But I think if we have this constant recording thing, that actually makes the heuristics of that much, much easier, right? We have every time that line was typed and where it was copied, where it was cut and pasted into. And I think that gives us a foundation of much, much more interesting tooling, a much better way of asking our code what it does. The other is constant merging. So what I'd like to propose, I think, of where version control goes is not we lock files and then piss off our coworkers in order to avoid merge conflicts, or we never talk to our coworkers until we have to merge in something from them that we didn't talk to them about. I think it's something in between, right? Of being able to constantly merge from people in a way that it's not committing to your history all the time, of having it sort of in your working directory, of maybe working on multiple branches simultaneously, right? Rather than having to choose one and sort of having them layer on top of each other in a sort of in-memory merge that can be handled separately, right? Where you don't have to choose one branch or another. You can work on multiple branches constantly, but also bring in work from your coworkers all the time and figure out as soon as possible what is conflicting, right? Who should I be talking to? I think that's very doable. And then the other class of things that I think is really interesting is, and I really, I don't love being the guy that comes up and is like, AI is going to change everything. But the reality is, for what we do, large language models can be incredibly valuable, right? It's actually very good at a lot of the things that we do. And it will start taking over a lot of the things, I think, that we were using Git for, or that our version control systems were doing. And there's some interesting. I don't know if you guys use Copilot and ChatGPT and stuff, but it has completely changed the way that I work in a matter of a couple of months, I think, right? Since ChatGPT came out and since I started using Copilot in beta, and because it's good, right? It helps save time, it helps save energy, and any tool that can do that for what we do, I think, is incredibly valuable. But in version control, I think there's a lot of interesting places that we'll start seeing AI come up. One, or large language models. I don't know what you guys prefer me to call them. I like large language models because it sounds less hypey, but really it's kind of the same thing, right? So what I am interested in is merge conflicts, because this is the thing that I think sucks probably the most about version control right now, right? Is you work on something, somebody else works on something, you merge them together, and it's like you go into this three-way editor and try to figure out, oh, is it theirs? Is it mine? Like, is it a class that moved over or something like that I have to put in my HTML? Like, what is the actual thing? And it takes forever, and I screw it up all the time. I wrote a book on Git, and I screw this up all the time, right? It is really, really difficult to do. And I've started doing some experiments with this of putting some of these prompts into ChatGPT and saying, if this is left and this is right, how would you solve it, right? And it's relatively good at doing that. And I think, and not only that, but we have a huge training set that we could take advantage of, right, to build specific models for this, because you can go through the history of any project on GitHub, any open source project, you can figure out which ones are merge commits. You can recreate, you can look at the parents, you can recreate it, you can see what the merge conflict was, and you have the resolution, right? And so building some model that gets very good at that, right? I think actually us manually handling merge conflicts is going to be a very, very small part, much smaller part of our lives than it is right now. The other is documentation. So like I sort of alluded to with the Google Docs thing, I think it's a little dumb to write commit messages, honestly, right? Because we're not sending them to a mailing list for the most part. In fact, most of us aren't good at it because of GitHub, because we use pull requests, and so you don't really care about the merge or about the commit messages. And the reason why you don't care about the commit messages is also cyclically because people aren't good at writing commit messages. And so GitHub, we tried to kind of cover it up with pull requests, right? And so you describe the change in the pull request, and you kind of ignore trying to have good commit messages, because they're not individually reviewable, and so it's not really that valuable. But it also it feeds into the cycle of people not caring about them. People care about the pull request message. But all of these things, I think, can be done relatively well with language models by looking at the code you changed, by looking at the conversations you were having in your engineering channel, by looking at how you were editing files sort of one after another, and saying, I think this is what you were doing, right? Looking at the issues that you were working on or the notes you were taking and saying, I'm pretty sure this is what you were doing and why you were doing it. Is that right? And you say, yep, that's right, right? I don't think going in and spending 15 minutes writing a commit message is going to be a thing that a lot of us spend a lot of time in a couple of years. And the other thing is code answers, right? This is something that you're already starting to see if you've used Cody by SourceGraph, or if you have access to Copilot X, you can start saying, I have this question about this code, right? And instead of going into my engineering channel and saying, hey, it looks like you were the last person kind of to edit this. What's the deal with that? How does it work? How do I edit it? I think AI will start being that smart guy in the engineering channel that has all the answers and is kind of mean, but he'll help you fix that problem. And then the last thing that I want to talk about, and then I'll let you guys move on, and hopefully have a beer with everybody later tonight, and you can tell me how I'm wrong about everything, is open source. So I think open source will change. I think with every step change that we looked at in the history of version control, there was a step change in open source, right? In how people contributed to open source, how people maintained projects, right? Opened how people used it, right? Like Linux wasn't really a thing until just before Git, right? It just open source was a completely separate part of our worlds. Now it would be ridiculous to start a company that wasn't based on open source, right? Microsoft is a big player in open source. If you'd told me that when I was 18, I would have slapped you in your face. Like, absolutely not. Like, Microsoft is going to be this big open source player. So, but I think actually there's a lot of problems with open source still. And I think how we look at our version control should be also how we look at what we want open source to be, right? And what open source, like some of the problems with open source is it's very difficult to maintain a project, right? There's actually probably very few people in this room that actively maintain open source projects, when it should be all of us really contributing to open source. It's also hard to contribute to an open source project. If you've ever actually tried to send a patch to an open source project, it's massively easier than it used to be, but it's not easy, right? But it could be. How nice would it be if we're pulling these snippets from ChatGPT or from Copilot or whatever, and we're pasting them in and we're verifying them and we're saying, okay, this works, or I have to edit it a little bit, okay, now it works. How nice would it be if you could hit a button and say, I want to open source that verification or that solution, right? And everybody's just doing these snippets, these smaller things, right? Libraries and larger projects, obviously they'll still have a place, but there's a lot of collaboration we can do on a much more micro level, right? And I think that there's a huge place for a new wave of open source with new version control tools to back it up. So that's pretty much it. What I really want from you, again, is to come up to me at some point today, or actually I guess it's just today, and tell me why I'm wrong or what excites you about something beyond Git, right? Because I think that it's interesting to all of us. It affects all of us. It affects all of open source. It affects all of software development. And whatever it is, there will be another GitHub type thing that continues to affect the way that we work and the way that open source happens. And so that is it. And I'd like to thank you very much for having me. Thank you.